I'm going to talk about Water for Life tools for watershed management. And just as a quick outline, I'm going to introduce Water for Life. I know most of you know a fair bit about Water for Life. You've been working with it for years, but there are going to be some of you who may not be so familiar. And I'd love to spend the whole talk talking about Water for Life, but I'll keep it just to a few slides. And then I'm going to talk about 2 or 4 documents our department has produced to support both state of the watershed reporting, and are in the middle of producing 2 reports for watershed management planning. Okay, what is Water for Life? Well, it is the primary policy the government has with respect to water management in Alberta. And it drives a lot of our programs related to water management. And you're likely familiar with, or many of you will be familiar with the 3 goals of Water for Life. That is a safe, secure drinking water supply, healthy aquatic ecosystems, and a reliable quality water supply for a sustainable economy. And I think we've garnered a lot of support for Water for Life just because these are such simple objectives, yet I think they resonate with pretty well everyone. Now, Water for Life was published in 2003 originally, and it was renewed in 2008 with the same objectives. I've been admiring all the beautiful photographs of landscapes and animals and birds and all the other presentations. And I have pictures of documents, so you're going to have to bear with me. Okay, there's also related to Water for Life, we have an action plan which has quite a list of recommendations that the government is committed to, including the development of supports for watershed management planning. That's where this initiative came out of. And I also mentioned one other document, enabling partnerships, because Water for Life is so much reliant on working with stakeholders in partnerships and in other ways. This captures our perspective on working with partnerships. So I'd recommend you have a look at this as well. Now, shared responsibility is one of the key principles for watershed management. And I just have a quote here from the Water for Life strategy. Citizens, communities, industry, and government must share responsibility for water management in Alberta and work together to improve conditions within their local watershed. And one approach is to form multi-stakeholder organizations like partnerships. And you may have heard of the Alberta Water Council, which has stakeholder representation that looks at some of the province-wide policy issues, and they provide advice to the government. Then there's also the Watershed Planning and Advisory Councils, and they are co-hosting this conference, and you've seen much of their work in the next room. And let's not forget the watershed stewardship groups. Sometimes they're multi-stakeholder, but often they're just local citizens who are organizing shoreline cleanups and community events to learn more about their watershed. And they're just as important as the other partnerships. Now, moving towards planning, it is a key for watershed management. You start with an assessment of the state of the watershed, and then identify important issues and plan how to address them. Now, here's my one photograph. I have enhanced it a bit, but you've probably seen this kind of image showing the activities on a landscape in the uplands and around the shore and on the water body itself, and how these all contribute to cumulative effects. And this is what the state of the watershed is trying to get at. What are all the influences within the watershed that are affecting the state of the watershed? And moving around the booths next door, you would have seen many examples of state of the watershed reports produced by our WPACs. And they can range from technical documents, summary documents, report cards, websites, and so on. And the two supports we've produced for State of the Watershed reporting are this handbook for State of the Watershed reporting and a guide to reporting on common indicators used in State of the Water reporting. And here's my picture of the handbook document. Here it is in real life. Okay, it describes how assessments may be done. Okay, yes, it's not a prescriptive list of things you must do to create a State of the Watershed report, but it is a guide and a suggestion and an outline of all the things you need to consider when you're doing a State of the Watershed report. And the main audiences in Alberta, the WPACs are main players in doing State of the Watershed reports for our large river basins. But watershed stewardship groups get involved in State of the Watershed reporting, local municipalities get involved, and pretty well anyone who wants to be involved in State of the Watershed reporting should have a look at this handbook. And it goes through a lot of the different points to consider when you're doing a State of the Watershed report. How is this State of the Watershed report going to be used? What is the appropriate scale? Are you looking at a tributary, watershed for a tributary, major river, a lake? What is the scope? Are you going to focus on water quality, or are you going to focus on the headwaters? Are you going to focus on, is it going to be a comprehensive State of the Watershed report? What are the indicators that you will be using, which are determined in part by the scope? How often should the assessment be done? Because once you've done the State of the Watershed report, it's just a snapshot in time. And it's important that maybe 5 or so years later, you take another snapshot and see how things have changed. And what format are you going to use? As I mentioned, they can be technical reports, report cards, web-based, and so on. Now the handbook describes how the assessment may be done. It also asks you to consider who will contribute to the State of the Watershed report. Where is the available information? Who are the experts? The handbook gives advice regarding selection of indicators, and it lists some characteristics of good indicators. Now the handbook also has a very large appendix with describing various information sources. And this is the appendix, and I don't know if you can tell, but it's about half of the report. Okay, so there's a lot of information about various information sources, and it ranges from Stats Canada, the Alberta Geological Survey, various provincial government departments, the Royal Alberta Museum, other government and non-government sources of information. It talks about maps, aerial photographs, and so on. So you can see how handy this handbook would be. Now I'm moving to the guide to reporting on common indicators used in State of the Watershed reports. And here it is in real life. Now we notice with all these State of the Watersheds being produced that there are certain characteristics that appear in nearly all of the State of the Watershed reports. Examples are nutrient levels, annual flow, linear disturbance across the watershed. Often it's because these are very important characteristics, and sometimes it's because there's data available. But regardless, they do appear in many of the State of the Watershed reports, and it seems to have made sense that there be fairly consistent reporting on these parameters to allow comparison with other watersheds, or even to allow the readers to become more familiar with certain indicators and in how they're reported. And so we took it upon ourselves to develop a guide to reporting on common indicators. It's not meant that they have to be included in every State of the Watershed report, And it deals with both single indicators, like concentrations of total phosphorus, density of groundwater wells, and things that are easily measured and reported on, and you can draw charts and graphs. But as well, there are some common complex indices that are used in many of these State of the Watershed reports. And there's a river flow quantity index, fish sustainability index, a river nutrient quality index, and various other indices. So these are all described in this handbook. And there are 5 topics covered. Surface water quality, and I won't go through all the different indicator types, but surface water quantity, groundwater, landscape features, and the biological community. So it covers a full range of indicator topics you might want to include. Now, both of these documents are available for downloading from our website, Alberta Environment and Sustainable Resource Development. And I think I brought some takeaway sheets of this slide if you want. You can also phone our information center, and they have a limited supply of hard copies like this. And I'll leave these on the table for you to look at. But now we're going to shift from State of the Watershed reporting to watershed management planning. And we have 2 draft documents available, so I can't hold up anything or show pictures of anything. One is the protocol for watershed management planning, and the second is a guide to watershed management planning in Alberta. Now, the protocol for watershed management planning, we're still struggling a bit with the word protocol. But what it is, it's a high-level government perspective on why we need watershed plans and what we expect to find in watershed plans, what we want, what watershed plans are. The guide to watershed management planning is more a how-to document, and similar to the handbook for State of the Watershed reporting. It's not it's not prescriptive, but it is a suggestion on how you might approach watershed management planning. I'll run through a few points that I gleaned from the draft protocol. It describes the context for watershed management planning, and that includes the policy, legislation, which watershed management plans must fit within that context. They also must align with senior planning initiatives, and there was a reference in another session talking about the regional planning under the land use framework. Those are approved by cabinet, and sub-regional plans must be aligned with those. It broadly defines the relationship between watershed management plans and planning being pursued at other scales in the province. And another speaker talked about the relationship between watershed management plans and municipal plans. So that's something this protocol will touch on as well. And it provides general direction and guidance to those engaged in watershed management planning. And more of the topics covered in the protocol, an overview with a vision, goals, and principles for watershed management planning. Again, I've talked about policy context, roles and responsibilities in watershed management planning, public participation, outputs from the process, and how the government of Alberta supports the plan. I'll remind you that watershed management plans are non-statutory, they are advisory. They are still very important. They're flexible in scope and scale. You have to determine those yourself when you're doing a plan. And the plan can serve many purposes, and advice to various stakeholders who make decisions related to watershed management, input into the regional plans, input into environmental management frameworks. Those are Those are tools that are included in regional plans to identify targets for things like water quality and water flow and so on, and various other uses. Now the Guide to Watershed Management Plan, again, this is where I would normally hold up the document, but because it's draft, I can't do that. It describes a six-stage, 16-step process for development and implementation of a watershed management plan. And I told you already it was not a prescriptive document. These are the 6 stages. And I won't go through the 16 steps, so you don't have to worry. Generally, first you start with the State of the Watershed report, so you understand what the issues are. And you bring together stakeholders to develop the plan. You develop the plan. Many guides would stop there. Okay, you've got the plan. But this guide will go into implementation and how the plan needs to be implemented. You also have to monitor implementation and report on progress. Make sure everyone knows how things are going with implementation. And in the end, with any watershed management plan, at some point you need to revisit and see if there are new issues that need to be addressed, and adapt the plan to those new issues. Now for these documents, one thing I can say is watch for the announcement. We're hoping to publish them both in the spring this year.